I'm Alex, 27 now, but this story really started when I was a kid. I grew up knowing exactly where I stood in my family, at the bottom. My parents never bothered to hide it. My older brother, Ethan, was the golden child. Everything he did was perfect, even when it wasn't. He got away with skipping school, wrecking my dad's car when he was 16, and even getting arrested once for shoplifting. My parents? They bailed him out, laughed it off, and blamed his troubled genius mind. Me? I got grounded for getting a B in math. I used to think maybe I was imagining it, that maybe all siblings felt like their parents favored one child. But no, my parents made it crystal clear. When I was 10, I asked my mom why Ethan got a laptop for his birthday, and I got a sweater. She didn't even blink when she said, "Because he's special. You're not the favorite. Deal with it." That was their favorite phrase. Deal with it. At 12, I stopped asking for things. At 16, I stopped trying to impress them. And by the time I left for college, I had accepted that no matter what I did, I would never be enough for them. But the real breaking point didn't come until a year ago. It started with my grandfather's will. He passed away when I was 26, and to my complete shock, he left nearly everything to me. My grandfather and I had always been close. He used to tell me, "Alex, you're the only one in this family with a good head on your shoulders." But I never expected him to actually leave me his house, his savings, and his old car, everything he had. Ethan got nothing. The moment the will was read, the temperature in the room dropped. My mom turned to the lawyer and actually asked if there had been some sort of mistake. Ethan was sitting there, mouth open, looking like someone had just run over his dog. And my dad? He was quiet at first. Then, in the car ride home, he suddenly said, "You know what the right thing to do is?" I just stared at him. "The right thing? You give Ethan half." I laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. They spent the next 3 weeks calling, texting, and guilt-tripping me. My mom cried about how Ethan was struggling and needed this more than I did. My dad tried the whole family legacy angle. "Ethan? He just sent me texts like you don't even need it. Stop being selfish." It wasn't about the money for them. It was about the fact that, for the first time in my life, I had something they wanted and they couldn't stand it. The worst part? They had never cared about my grandfather when he was alive. They visited him maybe twice a year, always on holidays, just to keep up appearances. But now, suddenly, his money was their business. So, after a month of constant pressure, I cut them off. Completely. I blocked their numbers, deleted them from social media, and changed the locks on my grandfather's house, where I had moved in. It wasn't easy. There were moments where I felt guilty, moments where I almost caved. But then I'd remember all the years of being treated like I didn't matter. They hadn't cared about me when I was growing up. They only cared now that I had something they wanted. And then, a year passed. A peaceful, quiet year where I started living my own life. Until last week. I was coming home from work, exhausted, when I saw them. My parents. Standing on my porch. And they weren't alone. Ethan was there too, looking smug, and behind them was a woman I didn't recognize, a lawyer. Maybe? My mom's face lit up when she saw me, as if the last year had never happened. "Oh, sweetheart. We were just waiting for you." My dad, standing stiffly, nodded. "We need to talk." And Ethan? He just grinned, like he already knew what was coming next. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. I had no idea what they wanted this time, but I knew it wasn't good. I stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, gripping my keys so hard they left marks in my palm. My parents were acting like nothing had happened, like they hadn't spent a year trying to manipulate me into giving up what my grandfather had left me. I glanced at Ethan. He had that smug, lazy grin he always wore when he thought he had already won. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I said flatly. My mom gasped, clutching her chest like I had just stabbed her. "Alex, is that any way to talk to your mother?" My dad took a step forward, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "This is serious. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." I raised an eyebrow. "Right. Because the last time I heard from you, it was nonstop messages about how I should give Ethan half of my inheritance. And when that didn't work, you all went silent." I looked at them each in turn, my voice cold. "So what changed?" Ethan scoffed. "Are you done being dramatic?" I turned to him. "Are you done being entitled?" His smirk twitched, but before he could snap back, the woman standing behind them finally spoke. She was tall, in her 40s maybe, with sharp eyes and a black blazer that screamed lawyer. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, like she was used to defusing tense situations. "I'm Miss Holloway. Your parents have asked me to mediate a conversation regarding the estate left by your grandfather." I blinked. "There's nothing to mediate." Miss Holloway ignored that and pulled out a folder. Your parents believe there may have been an error in the will. They'd like to discuss a fair redistribution. I laughed. I actually laughed. A sharp, humorless sound. An error. My mom immediately stepped in. Sweetheart, you have to understand, your grandfather was very old, and he wasn't always in the best state of mind. He might not have been thinking clearly when he wrote that will. I clenched my jaw. He was in a better state of mind than you ever gave him credit for. Ethan groaned, rubbing his face. Look, this is ridiculous. You're living in a house you don't even deserve. You're sitting on money you didn't earn. Meanwhile, I've been struggling, and you don't even care. I tilted my head. Struggling? Ethan wasn't struggling. He had a cushy job at some marketing firm, one that my dad had pulled strings to get him. He still lived in his fancy apartment downtown, drove a car that cost more than my entire college tuition, and spent his weekends partying. What exactly are you struggling with? I asked, crossing my arms. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not the point. No, I think it is. I turned to my parents. You're actually trying to contest the will? My dad exhaled sharply. We don't want it to come to that. But Alex, think about it. Ethan's your brother. We're your family. All we're asking for is some fairness. Fairness. My voice was rising now. Where was fairness when you spent my entire childhood reminding me that I wasn't your favorite? Where was fairness when I had to work twice as hard just to get a fraction of the attention you handed Ethan on a silver platter? My mom sniffled. We didn't mean to make you feel that way. I shook my head. You meant every word. And now, because you didn't get what you wanted, you're trying to rewrite history. Miss Holloway cleared her throat. Mr. Carter, your parents are willing to settle this amicably. They simply want a fair division of assets. I turned to her, my voice deadly calm. And if I say no? She hesitated. Then they may have to take legal action. I exhaled slowly, forcing my heartbeat to steady. You know what's funny? I said after a moment. For the first time in my life, I have something you can't control. And you hate it. That's what this is really about. Ethan rolled his eyes. God, just stop playing the victim, and I stepped forward, cutting him off. You are not stepping foot in this house. I pointed at my parents. None of you are. I turned to Ms. Holloway. Tell them to file whatever paperwork they want. I'll be waiting. And with that, I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and shut it in their faces. I barely made it to the couch before my hands started shaking. They were actually trying to take this to court. I sat there for a long time, staring at the front door like it might burst open at any second. My whole body was tense, my mind running 100 miles per hour. Could they actually do this? Contest the will? I grabbed my laptop and started researching. Turns out, contesting a will wasn't easy. They'd have to prove my grandfather was mentally incompetent when he wrote it, or that he was somehow pressured into leaving everything to me. But I knew for a fact that wouldn't hold up in court. My grandfather had been sharp until the very end. He'd updated his will just 6 months before he passed, completely on his own, with a lawyer he trusted. But the fact that they were willing to go this far, that was what really got to me. After everything, after years of treating me like I was nothing, my parents and Ethan still expected me to hand over what was mine. And when I didn't, they went straight to threats. Well, if they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I half expected my parents to show up again, or for Ethan to send another smug text. But there was nothing. It was unsettling. Then, a week later, I got the letter. A thick envelope in the mail. The return address? A law firm. I ripped it open, my stomach twisting. Inside was an official notice. My parents and Ethan were formally contesting my grandfather's will. I let out a slow breath. They were really doing it. The document claimed my grandfather had been influenced by me and that the will didn't reflect his true intentions. They were asking for the court to either divide the inheritance evenly, or, more insultingly, to give it all to Ethan, because, as the eldest son, he was always meant to inherit the family assets. I almost laughed at the absurdity. Me? Influencing my grandfather? If anything, I had never even talked to him about his will. He had made his decision on his own, probably after years of watching how my parents treated me versus Ethan. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. This was going to court. I wasted no time. I called the lawyer who had handled my grandfather's estate. When I explained the situation, she sighed. I had a feeling this might happen, she said. Your parents were not pleased when they heard the will was ironclad. Can they actually win? I asked. She hesitated. Unlikely, but it depends. If they can convince a judge that your grandfather was manipulated or mentally unfit, they could get some traction. It would still be an uphill battle for them, but it'll cost you time and money to fight it. I gritted my teeth. Of course, that was probably part of their plan, to drag me into court, force me to waste money on legal fees, and wear me down until I caved. They weren't just after the money. This was about control, about punishing me for stepping out of my place. Well, I said, they're in for a surprise. Because if they wanted a war, I was ready to go nuclear. The first thing I did was go through every document my grandfather had left behind. His will, his medical records, his bank statements, everything. I wanted to be ready for anything they threw at me. And the more I dug, the more I realized something. My parents were broke, or at least close to it. They had always acted rich. My dad had a decent job, my mom liked to show off at charity events, and Ethan lived like he had an endless trust fund. But as I looked through old bank records my grandfather had kept, I noticed something disturbing. My parents had been taking loans. Lots of them. Credit lines. Refinancing the house. Cash advances. I sat back, my heart pounding. This wasn't just about greed. This was desperation. That's why they needed my inheritance so badly. Not just for Ethan, but to bail themselves out. And suddenly, I had an idea. A way to turn the tables on them completely. The next time I heard from them was through their lawyer. They wanted a settlement. Basically, they were offering to drop the case if I gave them a reasonable portion of the inheritance. My lawyer called me after reviewing their offer. They're asking for 60%, she said, almost laughing. I shook my head. Unbelievable. They're trying to act like they're being generous, she continued. But honestly, this just makes them look worse. It shows they don't actually believe they can win in court. I grinned. Then let's make sure they lose. I told her to reject the settlement. And then I made a few phone calls of my own. I dug deep into their finances. I found out just how much they owed, how many late payments they had, how they were on the verge of losing everything. Then, I sent an anonymous tip to some financial reporters about a certain well-known family living beyond their means. A few weeks later, an article dropped about local families drowning in debt, living fake wealthy lifestyles. And guess whose names were in it? My parents. The moment the article went public, they panicked. My dad's work found out. My mom's social circle turned on her. Ethan, his image was ruined. And that was before the court case even started. They wanted to play dirty? I had barely begun. The fallout from the article was immediate and brutal. My parents had spent decades curating their image as a wealthy, well-respected family. My mother thrived on her reputation in high society circles, and my father built his career on the illusion of financial stability. But now, their dirty laundry was out in the open for everyone to see. The article didn't just expose their debt, it revealed just how deep the hole was. The loans, the unpaid bills, the second mortgage they had taken out to maintain their perfect lifestyle. Even Ethan's reckless spending habits were put under a microscope. I knew my mother would be devastated. She cared more about appearances than anything. But what really made me smirk was picturing Ethan's reaction. He had always acted like he was untouchable, like money would always magically appear for him. Now, the world saw him for what he really was, an entitled, spoiled brat who had burned through everything his parents had. And the best part? This wasn't even my final move. I expected my parents to come running back, to demand an explanation, to throw another tantrum. Instead, they went quiet. Too quiet. For the next few weeks, I waited for their next move, but all I got were whispers from distant relatives. My aunt called me out of the blue, pretending to check in, but I could tell she was fishing for information. Your mother is going through a lot right now, she said, voice tight. Maybe you should reach out. I nearly laughed. Reach out. I repeated. You mean the same woman who just tried to sue me for my own inheritance? She was hurt, my aunt said, and I could practically hear the mental gymnastics. This has been hard for all of them. I let the silence drag until she got the hint. The next day, I got a text from Ethan. Ethan texted, "Hope you're happy. You ruined mom and dad's lives." I replied, "No, they did that to themselves. I just stopped covering for them." Ethan texted, "Grandpa would be ashamed of you." I clenched my jaw. That one stung. Not because it was true, but because I knew exactly what Ethan was doing. He had always been good at guilt-tripping me. For years, he had used our parents' words as weapons, making me feel small, making me question myself. But this time, it didn't work. I replied, "Grandpa left everything to me for a reason. He saw through the lies. Maybe you should too." No response. Typical. Then came the court date. I arrived with my lawyer, dressed sharp but calm. My parents were already seated, looking significantly worse than the last time I saw them. My mother's usual elegance was gone, her makeup looked rushed, and the stress lines around her mouth were deeper. My father looked stiff, his hands clasped so tightly they were turning white. Ethan, on the other hand, looked furious, like a kid who had been told Christmas was canceled. As I sat down, my mother turned to me, her voice low but dripping with venom. "Are you proud of yourself?" I met her gaze evenly. "Are you?" Before she could answer, the judge walked in, and the case began. Their lawyer opened with some half-hearted argument about how my grandfather had been pressured by me, that he hadn't been in his right mind when he changed the will. But the moment my lawyer stood up, she shredded their claims apart with cold, hard facts. She pulled out signed medical reports from my grandfather's doctors, all confirming his mental sharpness. She presented records of his independent meetings with his attorney, proving that he had made his decisions without coercion. Then came the real kicker. She showed a letter. A personal letter my grandfather had written to me before he passed. It wasn't legally necessary, but it was the final nail in the coffin. In it, he explained his decision. He had seen how my parents treated me. He had watched Ethan grow up into someone who felt entitled to everything but worked for nothing. He wanted me to have the resources to build my own life, free from their influence. When I glanced at my parents, my mother had gone pale. My father's jaw was clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. "Ethan?" He looked betrayed, as if it had never even occurred to him that Grandpa might have actually cared about me more than him. The judge ruled in my favor. The will was upheld. They had lost. After the ruling, I expected an explosion, a screaming match, some final desperate attempt to claw something back. Instead, they just left. No words, no final threats, just silence. I didn't hear from them for months. Not a call, not a text, not even some passive-aggressive email from my mother. It was eerie. At first, I thought maybe, just maybe, they had finally given up, that they had accepted their loss and moved on. I should have known better. One night, I was coming home late from work when I noticed a car parked across the street from my apartment. Black sedan, tinted windows. It had been there a few times before, but I brushed it off as coincidence. That night, though, as I walked up my front steps, the driver's side window rolled down. And there was Ethan. He looked rough. Unshaven, hollow-eyed, his usual smug arrogance replaced with something desperate. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me. I turned to unlock my door. "Wait." His voice cracked. Just talk to me for a second." I sighed, crossing my arms. "What do you want, Ethan?" He swallowed hard. "They're gone." I blinked. "What?" "Mom and Dad. They left." His fingers clenched on the steering wheel. After the lawsuit, things got worse. The debts caught up. They burned through everything. The house got foreclosed on last month. I frowned. And Ethan let out a bitter laugh. And they ran, packed up whatever they could and disappeared. No forwarding address. No goodbyes. Nothing. He exhaled sharply. They left me with everything. The collectors, the mess. Just abandoned me. I studied him carefully. For the first time in his life, Ethan was experiencing what I had grown up with, being left behind, being treated as disposable. And it was breaking him. He rubbed his face. "I don't know what to do, man. I'm drowning." A long silence stretched between us. And then I said, "That's not my problem." His head snapped up. "Come on, don't be like that. We're family." "No," I said coldly. "We're not. Family doesn't treat each other the way you did. Family doesn't stand by while one person is treated like garbage just because it benefits them." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I didn't have a choice." "You always had a choice," I shot back. "And you always chose them." He stared at me, chest rising and falling rapidly. I could see the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, the frustration that, for the first time ever, his words weren't working on me. I turned toward my door. "Good luck, Ethan. You're gonna need it." I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. Through the peephole, I watched him sit there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, breathing heavily. Then, without another word, he drove away. That was the last time I ever saw him. I don't know where my parents went. I don't care. They built their lives on lies, on manipulation, on using people and throwing them away. And in the end, they did the same thing to their golden child. Poetic, isn't it?